The letter slipped from the clothesline like a whispered secret, tumbling across the dusty yard of the boarding house in Roswell, New Mexico, and landing squarely at the boots of Hayes Mitchell as he led his horse toward the water trough. Hayes bent down, his leather gloves creaking as he picked up the cream-colored paper, still warm from the afternoon sun of August 1876. The handwriting was delicate, flowing across the page in loops and curves that spoke of careful education and tender feeling. He did not mean to read it, truly he did not, but his eyes caught the first line before he could stop himself. My dearest William, today the heat was so fierce that I thought of the winter we spent in Boston, when you held my hand beneath the table at Christmas dinner. Hayes frowned. He was standing in the yard of the only boarding house in Roswell, a town barely 5 years old and still rough around the edges. There was no married woman here who fit such refined writing, not that he knew of. He glanced up at the clothesline, where more letters hung pinned between bed linens and cotton dresses, all fluttering in the hot breeze that offered no relief from the relentless sun. The boarding house door opened, and a woman emerged carrying a basket of wet laundry. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark blonde hair pinned up in a practical bun that was already losing strands to the wind. Her dress was simple calico, faded from washing but clean and well mended. When she saw him holding the letter, she froze, her face going pale beneath the flush the heat had painted on her cheeks. "That is mine," she said quietly, setting down the basket and walking toward him with careful steps, as though approaching a spooked horse. Hayes held out the letter, but his curiosity got the better of his manners. "I apologize for reading it, madam, but I could not help noticing. Is your husband away?" The woman took the letter from him, clutching it against her chest. Her eyes, he noticed, were a striking green, the color of spring grass after rain, something he had not seen much of in this dry country. "I am not married, sir, but the letter is mine, as I said." Her chin lifted slightly, defensively. "Thank you for retrieving it. The wind is terrible today." She turned to go, but Hayes found himself speaking before he thought better of it. "You write to a husband who does not exist." The woman stopped. For a long moment she stood with her back to him, her shoulders rigid. Then, slowly, she turned around. The defiance in her eyes had been replaced by something else, exhaustion, perhaps, or resignation. "What business is it of yours, Mr. Mitchell?" Hayes blinked in surprise. "You know my name. Everyone in Roswell knows who you are. You run cattle on the land east of town. You come in once a month for supplies, and you keep to yourself." She tilted her head slightly. "You are not the only one who observes others, sir." "Hayes," he said, removing his hat. The sun beat down on his dark hair immediately, but it seemed important to show respect. "My name is Hayes, Miss Brennan, Beatrice Brennan." She shifted the letter in her hands, not meeting his eyes now. "And yes, before you ask, I write to a husband who never existed. I have done so for 2 years now." The confession hung in the air between them like heat shimmer off the desert floor. Hayes should have tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and ridden away. A sensible man would have. But Hayes had spent the last 3 years building his ranch from nothing, sleeping under stars more often than roofs, and speaking more to cattle and horses than to people. Something about this woman's quiet sadness, about the careful loops of her handwriting on that letter, made him stay. "Why?" he asked simply. Beatrice looked at him then, really looked at him, as though measuring whether he deserved an answer. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she gestured to the small bench beside the boarding house door. "I will tell you, but not standing in this heat. Come." Hayes tied his horse to the post and followed her to the bench. They sat at opposite ends, a careful distance between them that propriety demanded. Beatrice smoothed the letter on her lap, her fingers tracing the words she had written. "I came to Roswell 2 years ago from Boston," she began, her voice low and measured. "My father had died, my mother had passed when I was a child, and I had no siblings. I had been working as a seamstress, but the woman who employed me was closing her shop. I had a small inheritance, enough for a train ticket and little else. I had heard that the West needed teachers, needed women who could read and write and help build schools. There is no school in Roswell yet," Hayes observed. "No, there is not. I learned that upon my arrival." A bitter smile crossed her lips. "I also learned that a single woman, even one with decent education and good intentions, is viewed with suspicion. The other women at the boarding house, they are kind enough, but they watch me. They wonder why I have no family, no husband. They whisper." Hayes understood then. The West was hard on women alone. Without the protection of a husband or family, a woman was vulnerable, subject to both gossip and unwanted attention. "So you invented a husband," he said slowly. "Yes. William Brennan, a wonderful man who married me in Boston before I came west. He is a surveyor, you see, traveling constantly for his work. He sends me letters, I write them myself, then pin them up as though they arrived in the mail. And I write back to him, letters full of my days, my thoughts, my dreams." She looked down at the paper in her lap. "It is foolish, I know. It is lonely," Hayes said quietly. Beatrice met his eyes, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared isolation. "Yes," she whispered. "It is terribly lonely." For a moment neither spoke. A dust devil spun across the yard, and Hayes's horse nickered softly at the trough. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. "Write to me instead," Hayes heard himself say. Beatrice stared at him. "I beg your pardon." "Write to me instead of to William." Hayes turned his hat in his hands, suddenly aware of how forward he was being, how strange this request must sound. "I live 20 miles from town, alone except for my hired hands who come and go. I have not had a real conversation in months. If you need someone to write to, someone real, write to me, Mr. Mitchell Hayes." "Hayes." She said his name carefully, as though testing its shape. "That is a very unusual proposition." "I suppose it is." Hayes stood, settling his hat back on his head. "Think on it. I will be in town next month, first Saturday of September. If you decide you want a real correspondent instead of an imagined one, leave a letter for me at the general store. I will write back." He untied his horse and swung into the saddle, looking down at her. Beatrice had risen from the bench, still holding that letter, her expression unreadable. "Why would you do this?" she asked. "You do not know me." Hayes considered the question. The honest answer was complicated, tangled up in 3 years of self-imposed solitude, in the death of his own family back in Missouri, in the bone-deep weariness of building a life with his hands while his heart stayed empty. But he settled for a simpler truth. Because everyone deserves to be heard by someone real, Miss Brennan, even if it is just in letters. He touched his hat brim and rode away, not looking back, though he felt her eyes on him until he rounded the corner onto the main street. The month that followed was the longest Hayes could remember in recent years. He worked his cattle, repaired fences damaged by summer storms, and tried not to think about whether Beatrice Brennan would leave him a letter. He told himself it did not matter, that he had made the offer out of kindness and nothing more. But on the first Saturday of September, he found himself riding into Roswell an hour earlier than necessary, his heart beating faster than the situation warranted. The general store was busy, full of ranchers and their wives stocking up for the coming autumn. Hayes nodded to a few familiar faces as he made his way to the counter, where old Samuel Porter presided over his domain of dry goods and gossip. "Hayes Mitchell," Samuel greeted him with a gap-toothed grin. "Got your usual order ready. Flour, coffee, sugar, tobacco, anything else you need. Is there any mail for me?" Hayes tried to keep his voice casual. Samuel's eyebrows rose. "Mail for you? That would be a first." But he turned to check the cubby holes behind him anyway, running a gnarled finger along the slots. "Well, I'll be. There is something here." He pulled out a cream-colored envelope, the same shade as the letter that had blown into Hayes's path a month ago. The handwriting on the front was that same elegant script, "Mr. Hayes Mitchell." Hayes took the letter, his fingers closing around it carefully. "Thank you, Samuel." "Secret admirer?" Samuel asked with a wink. "Just correspondence," Hayes replied, tucking the letter into his vest pocket. He was not about to open it in front of Samuel Porter, who would have the contents spread across town before sunset, exaggerated and embellished beyond recognition. He loaded his supplies onto his pack horse with methodical care, forcing himself not to rush, not to draw attention. Only when he was well outside of town, on the long road back to his ranch, did he stop beneath a cottonwood tree and break the seal. The letter inside was 2 pages long, written in that same flowing hand. "Dear Hayes, I debated for 3 weeks whether to write to you. It seemed improper, perhaps even dangerous, to begin a correspondence with a man I barely know. But then I asked myself what was more dangerous, writing honest letters to a real person, or continuing to pour my heart out to a phantom of my own creation. You were right. Everyone deserves to be heard by someone real. I have been living half a life, pretending to have connections I do not possess, inventing comfort where there is only absence. Your offer, strange as it was, felt like a rope thrown to someone drowning. So yes, I will write to you if you truly meant your words, and perhaps you will write back and tell me about your ranch, your days, your thoughts. Perhaps we can both be a little less lonely. I should tell you more about myself, I suppose. I am 24 years old. I have been working as a seamstress here in Roswell, taking in mending and making dresses for the few women in town who can afford such things. It is not the teaching position I hoped for, but it keeps me fed and housed. I read whenever I can, though books are precious and rare here. My favorite author is Jane Austen. I managed to bring 1 volume of Pride and Prejudice with me from Boston, and I have read it so many times the pages are falling out. I miss trees. That is a foolish thing to confess, perhaps, but it is true. I miss the great oaks of Boston, the way their leaves would turn gold in autumn. Here, there is only endless sky and dust and the occasional stubborn cottonwood clinging to a creek bed. What do you miss, Hayes? What brought you to this hard country, and what keeps you here? I will be in town again at the end of the month. If you wish to reply, you may leave a letter for me at the general store, addressed to Beatrice Brennan. Yours in correspondence, Beatrice. Hayes read the letter 3 times, sitting beneath that cottonwood tree while his horses grazed, and the afternoon sun slanted through the branches. Then he folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope, tucking it into his saddlebag like the treasure it was. That evening, in his small ranch house with its rough-hewn furniture and sparse decorations, Hayes lit a lamp and pulled out paper and ink. His handwriting was nothing like Beatrice's elegant script. It was blocky and practical, the hand of a man who wrote out bills of sale and supply lists, not letters of feeling. But he did his best. Dear Beatrice, your letter arrived safely, and I am glad you decided to write. You asked what I miss and what brought me here. Those are fair questions, and I will try to answer them honestly. I came to New Mexico Territory 3 years ago from Missouri. My parents had a farm there, and I had 2 younger sisters. When I was 23, cholera came through our county. It took my mother first, then my sisters within days of each other. My father followed a week later. I buried them all in the space of 2 weeks, The farm felt like a graveyard after that. I could not stay, could not walk past my mother's garden or my sister's rooms without feeling the weight of all that absence. So I sold everything, packed what I could carry, and headed west. I had heard that New Mexico territory was opening up for ranching, that a man could claim land and build something new. I suppose I was trying to outrun grief, though I have learned that grief is faster than any horse. I miss my family. I miss my mother's laugh and the way my sisters would argue over who got to feed the chickens. I miss having people who knew me, really knew me, not just the surface of polite acquaintance. But this land has its own beauty, harsh as it is. I have learned to love the wide sky, the way storms build on the horizon, the resilience of the cattle who survive out here. I have built something with my own hands, and there is satisfaction in that, even if it is lonely work. You are not foolish to miss trees. I think we all carry pieces of home in our hearts, and we miss them like missing limbs. The cottonwoods here are not the same as the oaks you remember, but there is a grove of them along the creek that runs through my property. In the right light, they are beautiful. I will leave this letter at the general store when I come to town again in 2 weeks. I find myself already looking forward to your reply. Yours, Hayes. He sealed the letter and set it on the table, next to the lamp. Outside, coyotes were beginning their evening song, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmony. Hayes sat listening to them, thinking about a woman in Roswell who wrote to ghosts, and wondering what strange path had led them both to this moment of connection across the distance of their separate solitudes. The letters became a rhythm, a pulse that marked the passing weeks. Hayes would ride into town, leave a letter at the general store, collect Beatrice's reply. He began to learn her through those careful pages, her love of literature, her frustration with the limited opportunities for women in the West, her small joys and daily struggles. She wrote about the dresses she made, the way the light fell through the boarding house windows, the taste of the bread the landlady baked each Wednesday. In return, Hayes wrote about his ranch, the cattle, the hired hands who came to help with roundups. He wrote about fixing a fence in the rain, about a colt born in the spring, about the way the desert bloomed after a rare thunderstorm. He found himself writing things he had never spoken aloud, thoughts and feelings he had kept locked away since his family died. Their letters grew longer, more intimate. Not improper, never that, but honest in a way that felt more real than most face-to-face conversations Hayes had ever had. There was safety in the distance, in the paper and ink between them. They could be vulnerable without the risk of seeing judgment or pity in the other's eyes. 3 months into their correspondence, in early December, Hayes wrote something that surprised even himself. I would like to meet with you properly, Beatrice. Not just passing letters through Samuel Porter, but sitting together, perhaps taking a meal at the hotel restaurant. I know this is forward and I will understand if you refuse, but I feel as though I know you through your letters, and I would like to know you in person as well. If you are willing, I will be in town Saturday next. We could meet at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the hotel lobby where everything is public and proper. He hesitated before sealing that letter, wondering if he was pushing too far too fast. But the loneliness of his ranch house, especially as winter set in, felt heavier than usual. The letters had awakened something in him, a desire for connection that went beyond words on paper. Beatrice's reply came the following week. Yes. That was all it said, just that single word in the center of the page. But below it, she had added a postscript. I am nervous, Hayes. What if we disappoint each other in person? What if the people we have been in letters cannot exist when we are face to face? Hayes smiled as he read those words, recognizing his own fears reflected back at him. He wrote back immediately. Then we will have shared one good meal and an awkward afternoon, and we can return to being pen friends if that suits us better. But I do not think we will disappoint each other, Beatrice. I think we will simply be ourselves, which is all we have been in these letters anyway. Saturday arrived cold and clear, the kind of December day where the sky was painfully blue and the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Hayes dressed with more care than usual, choosing his best shirt, the one without any patches or stains. He shaved carefully, trimmed his hair as best he could without a mirror, and polished his boots. Looking at himself in the water trough, he could not tell if he looked presentable or ridiculous, but it would have to do. The ride to Roswell seemed to take forever and no time at all. Hayes arrived an hour early, left his horse at the livery, and walked the streets trying to calm his nerves. He had faced down rustlers, survived blizzards, pulled calves in difficult berths, but the thought of sitting across from Beatrice Brennan made his heart race like he was a green boy at his first dance. At 2:05, he entered the hotel lobby. It was a modest establishment, the only hotel in Roswell, with a small restaurant off to one side and a sitting area with worn velvet chairs. Hayes took a position where he could see the door and waited. Beatrice arrived exactly at 2:00. Hayes recognized her immediately, though she was dressed more formally than when he had seen her in the boarding house yard. She wore a deep blue dress that brought out the green of her eyes, and her hair was arranged in a more elaborate style, soft curls framing her face. She looked nervous and beautiful and utterly real. Hayes stood as she approached, his hat in his hands. "Beatrice." "Hayes." They stood looking at each other for a moment, and then, simultaneously, they both smiled. The tension broke like a soap bubble, and Hayes felt himself relax. "You are taller than I imagined," Beatrice said. "You are exactly as I imagined," Hayes replied, then worried that sounded too forward. But Beatrice's smile widened. "Shall we sit? I have been standing all morning and my feet are aching." They took a table in the restaurant, ordered coffee and sandwiches, and for a few minutes there was awkward silence. Hayes tried to think of something to say that would not sound stupid, but his mind had gone blank. It was Beatrice who broke the silence. "This is strange, is it not? I feel as though I know you so well, and yet I do not know how you take your coffee." "Black, no sugar," Hayes said, "and you, cream if they have it, and 1 spoon of sugar." She folded her hands on the table, studying him. "Your eyes are brown. I had wondered about that. You never mentioned it in your letters. I did not think it mattered." "Everything matters when you are trying to imagine someone," Beatrice said softly. "I have read your letters so many times I have them memorized, and I have tried to picture you writing them. I imagined you at a rough table by lamplight, maybe with your coat still on against the cold." "That is exactly right," Hayes said, surprised. "How did you know?" "Because that is how I write to you, at a small desk in my room, wrapped in a shawl by candlelight because lamp oil is expensive." She picked up her coffee cup, warming her hands on it. "I have been thinking about what you said about outrunning grief. I wonder if that is what I am doing too in my own way. I left Boston to escape being alone, but I brought the loneliness with me." "We cannot outrun ourselves," Hayes agreed. "I learned that the hard way, but maybe we can find new reasons to stay in one place, build new connections." "Is that what this is?" Beatrice asked, meeting his eyes. "A new connection. I hope so," Hayes said honestly. "These past months, your letters have been the best part of my weeks. I find myself thinking of things to tell you, saving up observations and thoughts for when I write. You have made the loneliness bearable." Beatrice's eyes glistened, and she looked down at her coffee. "You have done the same for me, more than you know." She took a breath, then met his gaze again. "Hayes, I must ask you something. Why did you truly offer to exchange letters with me? That day in the yard you could have walked away. Most men would have. Hayes considered his answer carefully. The truth was complicated, but she deserved nothing less. When I read that letter you wrote to William, I heard something in it that I recognized. A kind of yearning, a desire to be known and understood. I have felt that same thing every day since I lost my family. And when you said you wrote to a husband who never existed, I thought what a waste it was, all that feeling going nowhere to no one. He paused, choosing his next words with care. I suppose I was lonely enough to be brave, and you seemed lonely enough to perhaps understand. I do understand, Beatrice said. I understand exactly. They talked through the afternoon, the coffee growing cold and forgotten as they discovered the pleasure of spoken conversation after months of written words. They talked about books and land, about the past they had left behind and the uncertain future ahead. Hayes told her about his dreams for the ranch, about wanting to breed better cattle, maybe build a real house instead of the rough cabin he lived in now. Beatrice told him about her hope that Roswell would grow enough to need a school, that she could teach children the way she had always wanted. I know it may never happen, she admitted. This town may stay small, may even disappear like so many others. But I have to hope for something, or what is the point of being here? Hope is what keeps us going, Hayes agreed. Hope and stubbornness. Beatrice laughed, a clear, genuine sound that made Hayes's heart lift. You have certainly discovered my two primary qualities. As the afternoon lengthened toward evening, Hayes knew he should leave, should make the ride back to the ranch before full dark. But he found himself reluctant to end the day, to return to the silence of his empty house. May I walk you back to the boarding house? He asked as they finally rose from the table. I would like that, Beatrice said. They walked slowly through the streets of Roswell, past the general store and the blacksmith shop, past the saloon where piano music and laughter spilled out into the cold evening air. They did not touch, maintaining the proper distance between them, but Hayes was acutely aware of her presence beside him, the rustle of her skirts, the soft sound of her breathing. At the boarding house gate, they stopped. The windows glowed warm with lamplight, and Hayes could see the silhouette of someone moving inside. Thank you for today, Beatrice said. It was not awkward at all in the end. No, Hayes agreed. It was good, very good. Will you still write to me? There was vulnerability in her voice, a fear of losing what they had built. Of course, Hayes said. But perhaps we could also do this again. Meet in person, I mean, if you would like to. I would like that very much. Beatrice smiled up at him, and in the fading light, Hayes thought she was the most beautiful thing he had seen in this hard country. Next month, then. Same time, same place. Yes, Beatrice said. I will be there. Hayes tipped his hat and turned to go, but her voice stopped him. Hayes. He turned back. Yes. I am glad the wind blew that letter to you. I am glad you were brave enough to speak to me. So am I, Beatrice, so am I. The winter passed in a pattern of letters and monthly meetings. Hayes found himself living for those Saturdays when he would ride into Roswell and spend the afternoon with Beatrice. They would meet at the hotel, take a meal, and talk for hours. Sometimes they walked through the town despite the cold, Beatrice's hand occasionally touching his arm for balance on icy patches, each touch burning through his coat sleeve like a brand. Their letters continued, filling the gaps between their meetings. But the tone of them changed, grew warmer, more affectionate. Hayes found himself writing things he had never said aloud to anyone. I think about you constantly, Beatrice. When I am working, I imagine what you would think of the sunset or the way ice forms on the creek. I find myself wanting to share every moment with you, even the small, mundane ones. Beatrice wrote back with equal honesty. You have become essential to me, Hayes, not just a correspondent or a friend, but something more. I do not have a name for what I feel, but it fills me up until I think I might burst with it. Is it wrong to feel this way about someone I have known only a few months? Hayes replied, If it is wrong, then I am wrong too, because I feel the same. In February, a blizzard hit New Mexico territory, dumping snow across the landscape and making travel impossible for 2 weeks. Hayes paced his cabin like a caged animal, worried about Beatrice, unable to send or receive letters. When the snow finally cleared enough for travel, he rode to Roswell immediately, not waiting for their scheduled meeting day. He found Beatrice at the boarding house, safe and well, and the relief that flooded through him was so intense he felt weak with it. She answered the door when he knocked, and the surprise and joy on her face when she saw him made the grueling ride through snowdrifts worthwhile. Hayes, I was so worried about you. And I about you. Are you well? Did you have enough food, fuel for heat? Yes, we were fine here in town. But I thought of you out at the ranch, alone in that storm. She glanced behind her, then stepped outside, pulling a shawl tight around her shoulders against the cold. Hayes, I was frightened. I realized that if something happened to you, I might not even know. You could be hurt or sick or worse, and I would simply wait for letters that would never come. Hayes took her hands in his without thinking, propriety forgotten in the rush of emotion. I am here. I am safe. And Beatrice, I promise you, I will always come back. Nothing could keep me from you. She looked up at him, and he saw his own feelings reflected in her eyes. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something electric. Hayes wanted desperately to kiss her, but they were standing in front of the boarding house where anyone might see, where such an action would compromise her reputation. We should talk, he said quietly. Properly talk. But not here, the hotel, Beatrice suggested. Too public for what I need to say. Hayes thought quickly. Do you trust me? Yes, she said without hesitation. Bundle up warm, I want to show you something. 20 minutes later, they were riding double on Hayes's horse, Beatrice sitting side saddle in front of him, his arms around her to hold the reins. She fit against him perfectly, warm and solid and real. He rode them out of town to the cottonwood grove he had mentioned in his very first letter, the trees stark and beautiful against the snow. He helped her down from the horse, and they stood together among the cottonwoods, the silence of the snow-covered landscape wrapping around them like a blanket. Hayes had brought a buffalo robe from his saddle, and he spread it on a fallen log, gesturing for Beatrice to sit. I have been thinking, he began, standing before her, his hat in his hands. These months with you have been the happiest I have known since my family died. Your letters, our meetings, they have given me a reason to look forward instead of back. You have made me want to build a life again, not just a ranch. Beatrice's eyes were wide, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Hayes, what are you saying? I am saying this badly, he admitted. I have thought about how to say it 100 times, and now that the moment is here, the words are all tangled up. He took a breath, steadying himself. Beatrice, I am in love with you. I think I have been since you told me you wrote letters to someone who did not exist. I love your honesty, your courage, your beautiful words, and your hopeful heart. I love who I am when I am with you. Tears spilled down Beatrice's cheeks, freezing on her skin. I love you too, she whispered. So very much. I did not think I could feel this way, did not think anyone would ever truly see me the way you do. Hayes knelt in the snow before her, taking her hands. Then marry me, Beatrice. Not a pretend marriage to satisfy gossips, but a real one. Come live with me on the ranch. We can build a life together, a real life full of real love and real connection. We can be lonely together until we are not lonely anymore. Yes, Beatrice said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Hayes, I will marry you. I cannot imagine anything I want more. Hayes stood, pulling her up with him, and finally, he kissed her. She tasted like salt and cold and promise, and when she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, Hayes felt something inside him that had been frozen for 3 years begin to thaw. They were married in March, when the first wildflowers began to bloom across the desert. It was a small ceremony, held in the Methodist church that doubled as the town meeting hall. Samuel Porter stood up as Hayes's witness, and the boarding house landlady, Mrs. Cooper, stood up for Beatrice. A handful of townspeople attended, curious about the cowboy and the seamstress who had somehow found each other in this harsh land. Beatrice wore a dress she had made herself, pale yellow like the spring flowers, with lace she had carefully hoarded for just such an occasion. Hayes wore his best suit, bought special for the wedding in Santa Fe. When the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Hayes kissed his bride, he felt a completeness he had not known was possible. The ranch house was no longer empty. Beatrice filled it with her presence, with curtains she sewed for the windows and meals she cooked on the iron stove. She set up a small writing desk in the corner of the main room, where she could sit and watch the landscape while she worked on mending jobs she still took from town. Hayes added shelves for her books, which grew in number as he brought her volumes from Santa Fe whenever he made the trip for supplies. Their first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning to live together after years of solitude. They discovered each other's habits, both good and difficult. Hayes learned that Beatrice sang while she worked, old hymns and folk songs from her childhood. Beatrice learned that Hayes had nightmares sometimes, waking gasping from dreams of his family's deaths, and that the only thing that helped was her arms around him, her voice soft in the darkness assuring him he was not alone. They also discovered the pleasures of partnership. Hayes taught Beatrice to ride, and she proved a quick learner, soon accompanying him on short trips around the ranch. Beatrice taught Hayes to appreciate poetry, reading aloud to him in the evenings while he repaired tack or whittled. They worked side by side, building a life from the raw materials of land and love and determination. In July, when the heat was fierce and relentless, Beatrice told Hayes she was pregnant. He had been checking on the cattle at the far pasture, and she had ridden out to bring him lunch. They sat in the shade of a rock outcropping, eating bread and cheese when she said, almost casually, "We will need to build a cradle before winter." Hayes stared at her. "A cradle?" "Yes," she smiled, taking his hand and placing it on her stomach, which showed no signs of change yet. "For the baby, our baby." Hayes felt tears sting his eyes. A baby, a child, a family again after he had thought such a thing lost to him forever. "Beatrice," he said, his voice breaking. "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy." He laughed, pulling her close, careful even in his joy. "I am terrified and overjoyed and grateful all at once. A baby, our baby." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Thank you for giving me this." "We are giving it to each other," Beatrice corrected gently. "Everything we have, we build together." The pregnancy progressed through the hottest part of summer into autumn. Hayes worried constantly, fussing over Beatrice until she threatened to throw a skillet at him if he asked one more time if she needed to sit down. But beneath her exasperation, he could see she was touched by his concern, had never had anyone care for her so thoroughly. In late October, Hayes hired a woman from Roswell, an experienced midwife named Mrs. Santos, to come stay at the ranch as Beatrice's time grew near. He also insisted that Beatrice rest more, take on fewer chores, though she argued that women had been having babies while working for thousands of years, and she was perfectly capable of continuing. "Humor me," Hayes pleaded. "I have already lost one family. I could not bear to lose you." Beatrice's expression softened. "You will not lose me. I am stronger than I look, and Mrs. Santos knows what she is doing, but I will rest more for your peace of mind." The baby came on a cold November night, arriving 3 weeks earlier than expected. Hayes paced outside the bedroom door while Mrs. Santos and Mrs. Cooper worked inside, Beatrice's cries of pain cutting through him like knives. He had helped deliver countless calves, but this was different. This was his wife, his love, his whole world behind that door. When he finally heard a baby's cry, thin and wavering but strong, Hayes sank to his knees in relief. Mrs. Santos opened the door a moment later, smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Mitchell, a healthy boy, and your wife is doing well." A son. Hayes stood on shaking legs and entered the bedroom. Beatrice lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant with joy. In her arms was a tiny bundle, wrapped in the blanket she had knitted over the past months. "Hayes, come meet your son," she said softly. Hayes approached the bed as though walking on holy ground. He looked down at the baby, at the tiny red face and the miniature fingers curled into fists, and felt his heart expand in ways he had not thought possible. "He is perfect," Hayes whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, my love, thank you." "What shall we name him?" Beatrice asked. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Now, looking at his son, Hayes knew, "Thomas, after my father, if that is acceptable to you." "Thomas Mitchell," Beatrice said, testing the name. "Yes, that is exactly right." Hayes sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Beatrice placed the baby in his arms. Thomas, barely an hour old, opened dark eyes and seemed to look directly at his father. Hayes felt something settle in his chest, some last piece of grief finally finding rest. "I will take care of you," he promised his son, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you. I will build you a good life, teach you to be strong and kind. You will know you are loved every day of your life." "We will do it together," Beatrice said, echoing her earlier words. "Everything together." The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful. Thomas proved to be a healthy baby with powerful lungs and his mother's determination. He demanded attention at all hours, and Hayes and Beatrice took turns walking him when he fussed, singing to him, marveling at each tiny change and development. Hayes expanded the ranch house, adding 2 more rooms to accommodate their growing family. He hired more permanent hands, men he could trust, so he could spend more time with Beatrice and Thomas. The ranch prospered under his careful management, and he began to make a name for himself in the territory as a fair dealer with good stock. Beatrice established a small school in Roswell when Thomas was 2 years old, teaching the handful of children whose families had settled in the area. She would bring Thomas with her, and he would play quietly in the corner while she led lessons in reading and arithmetic. Hayes would ride in to collect them at the end of the day, and the 3 of them would ride home together, a complete family. On their 3rd wedding anniversary, Hayes took Beatrice back to the cottonwood grove where he had proposed. It was March again, the desert coming alive with blooms. Mrs. Santos had agreed to watch Thomas for the afternoon, giving them rare time alone together. They spread a blanket beneath the trees, the same buffalo robe from that winter day, and lay looking up through the branches at the brilliant blue sky. "You remember the letters?" Hayes asked, his fingers intertwined with Beatrice's. "Of course I remember. I have them all still, yours and mine. I thought someday we could show them to Thomas, let him know how his parents found each other." "A love story built on paper and honesty," Hayes mused. "It seems impossible when I think back on it. What were the chances that your letter would blow into my path that day? What were the chances you would say yes to such a strange proposition?" "I do not believe in chances anymore," Beatrice said. I believe we were meant to find each other. The loneliness, the letters, even the invented husband, it all led to this, to you and me and Thomas. To home. Home, Hayes repeated. Yes, you are my home, Beatrice. Not the ranch, not New Mexico territory. Wherever you are, that is where I belong. Beatrice turned on her side to face him, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. You saved me, you know. That day you told me to write to you instead. You saw me when I felt invisible. You gave me a reason to be honest, to stop hiding behind pretense. We saved each other, Hayes corrected. I was as lost as you were, just in a different way. You taught me that I could love again, that I could build a new family without betraying the memory of the one I lost. You gave me permission to be happy again. They kissed, soft and sweet, the wind moving through the cottonwood branches above them with a sound like whispers. 3 years ago, Hayes had been a lonely cowboy reading a letter meant for someone who did not exist. Now he was a husband, a father, a man with purpose and love and a future that stretched bright before him. I love you, Beatrice murmured against his lips. I will love you until the day I die and beyond. And I love you, Hayes replied. Thank you for writing to me instead. They stayed in the grove until the sun began to lower, talking about their dreams for the future. Hayes wanted to expand the ranch further, perhaps start breeding horses as well as cattle. Beatrice wanted to grow the school, maybe even establish a proper schoolhouse if the town continued to expand. They talked about having more children, about growing old together, about all the years ahead that would be filled with the ordinary miracles of shared life. As they rode back to the ranch, Thomas waiting for them with Mrs. Santos, Hayes reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. From Missouri and tragedy, across the plains to New Mexico territory and isolation. From loneliness to a chance encounter with a woman writing to a ghost. From tentative letters to love, marriage, family. Life was unpredictable, full of sorrow and joy intermingled. But Hayes had learned that even from loss could come new beginnings, that love could grow in the hardest soil if tended with honesty and care. The years continued to pass, each one adding new layers to the life Hayes and Beatrice built together. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere, learning about cattle and horses and the hard work of making a living from the land. When he was 4, he gained a sister, Margaret, named after Hayes's mother. 3 years after that came another son, William, and Hayes noticed with loving amusement that Beatrice had finally gotten her William, though this one was very real indeed. The ranch prospered beyond Hayes's early dreams. He became known throughout the territory as a man of integrity, someone whose word was as good as a contract. He bought additional land, built a proper barn, and established his brand as a mark of quality. But more than his success in business, Hayes took pride in his family. He taught his children to ride, to read the weather, to treat all people with respect regardless of their station. Beatrice taught them to read and write, to appreciate beauty, to be kind. Together, they created a home filled with laughter and love, with the kind of security neither of them had known growing up. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Hayes and Beatrice would sometimes take out the old letters, reading them aloud to each other and marveling at how young and uncertain they had been. The letters had yellowed with time, the ink fading, but the feelings expressed in them remained as powerful as ever. "Listen to this," Beatrice would say, reading from one of Hayes's early letters. "I write to you from the loneliness of my ranch, hoping these words find you well. Already you have become the bright spot in my weeks, the thought that sustains me through difficult days." She smiled at her husband across the table. "You were quite romantic even then." "I was desperate," Hayes corrected, but he was smiling too. desperate for connection, for someone who understood. And now I am simply grateful. Every day, Beatrice. Every day I am grateful for you, for our children, for this life we have built. Roswell grew around them, transforming from a rough frontier town into a real community. The school Beatrice had started expanded into a proper schoolhouse, built with funds from ranchers and townspeople who recognized the need for education. Beatrice taught there until Margaret was born, then handed the responsibility to a younger teacher from back east, though she still visited regularly and helped with special lessons. The boarding house, where Beatrice had once lived alone and lonely, became a family hotel, respectable and well-run. Mrs. Cooper, the landlady, became a dear friend, a godmother to their children. Samuel Porter retired from the general store, handing it over to his son, but he remained a fixture in town, always ready with a story about the old days. Hayes and Beatrice became pillars of the community, the kind of couple younger people looked to as an example of what a marriage could be. They were seen as lucky, as having found something rare and precious. But Hayes and Beatrice knew better. What they had was not luck, it was choice, daily choice to continue choosing each other, to work through difficulties, to prioritize their partnership above all else. There were hard times, of course. A drought in 1882 killed off a third of their cattle and nearly broke them financially. Hayes worked himself to exhaustion trying to save what he could, and Beatrice returned to taking and sewing to help make ends meet. But they survived, rebuilt, came back stronger because they faced the challenge together. There was illness, too. Margaret nearly died from scarlet fever when she was 6, and for 2 terrible weeks, Hayes and Beatrice took turns sitting by her bedside, praying and hoping and refusing to give up. When she finally turned the corner and began to recover, they held each other and wept with relief, understanding once again how fragile and precious their happiness was. Through it all, the foundation of their relationship remained those early letters, that initial honesty and vulnerability they had shared with each other. They never lost the habit of open communication, of telling each other their fears and hopes, of approaching their marriage as a partnership built on mutual respect and deep affection. When Hayes was 45 and Beatrice 43, with their children growing into young adults with lives and dreams of their own, they took a trip together to Santa Fe. It was the first time they had been away from the ranch for more than a day in over a decade, and the freedom of it felt almost illicit. They stayed in a real hotel, ate in restaurants, visited the shops and markets. They walked through the plaza holding hands like young lovers, and Beatrice bought a new dress, something impractical and beautiful just because she wanted it. Hayes commissioned a photograph of the two of them, the first they had ever taken together. On their last night before returning home, lying in the hotel bed with Beatrice in his arms, Hayes said, "If I could go back and tell that lonely cowboy reading a letter in a dusty yard what his future held, he would never believe me. What would you tell him?" Beatrice asked, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest. That the woman who wrote those letters would become his whole world, that she would give him children and joy and purpose, that every single day with her would be a gift, even the hard ones. That love was not just possible but inevitable when two people were brave enough to be truly seen. He kissed the top of her head. What would you tell the woman writing to a husband who did not exist? That her real husband would be better than any fiction she could create. That honesty would set her free, that the loneliness was not permanent, that salvation would come on horseback carrying a kind word and an impossible proposition. Beatrice tilted her face up to kiss him. I would tell her to say yes, to be brave, to trust that something real was so much better than something imagined. They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion of still burning desire, two people who knew each other's bodies and hearts completely. Afterward, as they drifted toward sleep, Hayes thought about how strange and wonderful life was, how the smallest moments could redirect entire destinies. A letter blowing from a clothesline, a cowboy brave enough to speak, a woman lonely enough to answer. From such small seeds, entire forests could grow. Thomas took over more and more of the ranch operations as Hayes entered his 50s, proving himself a capable manager with his own ideas about breeding and management. Margaret married a shopkeeper from Roswell, a good man who loved her completely, and they built a house in town. William, the youngest, surprised everyone by announcing his intention to study law, and Hayes and Beatrice scraped together the money to send him to school in Denver. The ranch house, once so empty and silent, was now filled with the noise of grandchildren during visits, with family dinners that required extra tables and chairs, with love expanding to include new generations. Hayes would sit at the head of the table, Beatrice at the other end, and marvel at how full his life had become. He still rose early most mornings, even when his joints ached and his back protested. He would make coffee, watch the sun rise over the land he had claimed and cultivated, and thank whatever force had brought him to this place, to this life. Then Beatrice would emerge from their bedroom, still beautiful to him even with silver in her hair and lines around her eyes, and she would kiss him good morning, and his day would truly begin. They established a tradition in their later years of returning to the Cottonwood Grove on their anniversary each March. They would pack a picnic, ride out together, and spend the afternoon reminiscing and dreaming. The buffalo robe had long since worn out, but Thomas had replaced it with a new one, and that was what they sat on now. On their 25th anniversary, Hayes brought a bottle of wine he had been saving and 2 tin cups. They sat beneath the cottonwoods, now old and gnarled but still beautiful, and toasted to their years together. 25 years, Beatrice mused, half a lifetime, and yet it feels like both forever and no time at all. I have loved you every day of those 25 years, Hayes said. Even the days we fought, even the hard days. Especially the hard days, perhaps because those are when love matters most. Do you ever regret it? Beatrice asked. Not us, but the way it happened, the strangeness of how we met. Hayes considered the question seriously, as he did all her questions. No, I think the strangeness was necessary. If we had met conventionally at a dance or through an introduction, we might have been polite strangers who never truly connected. The letters forced us to be honest, to share our real selves before we worried about making good impressions. That honesty became the foundation of everything. We still write to each other sometimes, Beatrice noted. Have you noticed? When you are out with the cattle for days, I write you letters even though you cannot receive them until you return. And you do the same when I visit Margaret in town. Old habits, Hayes said with a smile. Good habits. I like knowing that even after all these years, we still have things to say to each other in writing. We will never run out of things to say, Beatrice declared. Not in 100 years. They did not get 100 years, but they got close. Hayes died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. Beatrice beside him, his hand in hers. He had lived long enough to see all his children settled and happy, to hold 6 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, to build a legacy that would last beyond his lifetime. Beatrice mourned him deeply, but without the crushing despair she might have felt had she lost him earlier. They had been given so much time, so many good years, and she found comfort in that. She continued living at the ranch with Thomas and his family, helping raise her grandchildren, teaching them to read using the same books Hayes had bought for her decades ago. She lived 5 more years, and in those years, she wrote one final set of letters. Not to Hayes exactly, though they were addressed to him. More like a record of their life together, a testimony to what they had built from loneliness and chance and choice. When she died at 77, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, those letters were found tied with a ribbon in her desk drawer. Thomas read them aloud at her funeral, his voice breaking as he shared his parents' love story with the assembled community. "My dearest Hayes," the final letter began, dated just a week before her death. "I am coming to join you soon, and I find I am not afraid. How could I be when I am going to where you are? We built such a beautiful life from such strange beginnings." A letter to a husband who never existed, and a cowboy brave enough to say "write to me" instead. From that small seed grew our mighty tree, children and grandchildren, love and partnership, a life worth living. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Thank you for being real when I was hiding behind fiction. Thank you for every day, every letter, every moment. I love you now and always. Your Beatrice. There was not a dry eye in the church when Thomas finished reading. The story of Hayes and Beatrice Mitchell had become part of Roswell's history, a reminder that love could bloom even in the hardest soil, that honesty was the bedrock of lasting connection, that sometimes the strangest beginnings led to the most beautiful endings. Years later, when Thomas was an old man himself, telling his own grandchildren about their great-grandparents, he would take down the box of letters carefully preserved and let the children carefully unfold the yellowed pages. He would tell them about a lonely cowboy and a woman writing to ghosts, about how they found each other and built a dynasty of love. The letters eventually made their way to the Historical Society, where they were preserved as a record of frontier life and love. Researchers studied them, historians quoted from them, and occasionally someone would stumble across them and be moved by the raw honesty and tender affection expressed in that old-fashioned handwriting. The cottonwood grove remained, though the trees eventually died and new ones grew in their place. The ranch remained too, passed down through generations of Mitchells, each one adding to the legacy Hayes and Beatrice had started. The house was expanded, modernized, but the original cabin Hayes had built was preserved as a reminder of humble beginnings. And somewhere in the mystery beyond life, two souls who had found each other across loneliness and distance remained together, their love story complete, their letters a testament to the transformative power of being truly seen, truly known, truly loved. From a letter that blew from a clothesline to a legacy that lasted generations, Hayes Mitchell and Beatrice Brennan had proven that the smallest moments of courage, speaking to a stranger, answering with honesty, choosing connection over isolation, could change everything. Their story became a reminder that love was always possible, always worth reaching for, and that sometimes the best things in life began with the simple words, "Write to me" instead. The town of Roswell continued to grow and change, eventually becoming known for entirely different reasons in the next century. But old families remembered the Mitchells, remembered the story of how the town's most respected ranching family began with letters between lonely people. On anniversaries and special occasions, descendants would visit the Historical Society to see those original letters, running careful fingers over the faded ink, marveling at how their family tree had sprouted from such tender roots. In the end, Hayes and Beatrice's story was not remarkable because of grand gestures or dramatic events. It was remarkable because it was real, built on the daily choice to see each other, to speak truth, to build something lasting from the raw materials of honesty and hope. They had found each other in the wilderness, two lonely people who refused to let loneliness be their only story. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy they left behind, the knowledge that it was never too late to reach out, never foolish to hope, never wrong to write to someone real instead of someone imagined. In a hard land that demanded strength and resilience, Hayes and Beatrice had proven that vulnerability was the greatest strength of all, that opening your heart was the bravest thing a person could do. Their love story ended as all love stories must, with death and parting. But what they built together, the family, the legacy, the proof that connection was possible even in isolation, that lived on, generation after generation. A testament to what happens when two people are brave enough to say yes to possibility, to reach across loneliness and find, waiting on the other side, exactly what they needed. Someone real, someone true, someone who would say right to me instead, and mean it with their whole heart.